Thank you for joining today's webinar, Summer Feed Options, What's Going On in the Paddock. My name is Jodie Rizzo-O'Brien and I'm part of the Sheep Connect SA team. Today's webinar is supported by Australian Wool Innovation, the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund, the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board, through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program and the Landscape Levies. If you want to know more information about Sheep Connect, you can go to our website, sheepconnectsa.com.au, and I welcome you to follow us on Twitter to keep up to date with all our events. Our presenter today is Deb Scammell. Deb's a livestock consultant at Talking Livestock, based in the mid-north of South Australia. She works with producers to improve nutrition and production planning in their sheep and beef enterprises. Over the last few years, Deb has been keenly involved in improving performance in lamb feedlots and feeding using containment due to poor seasonal conditions. At this time, I'll hand over to Deb, who talked to us about summer feed options. Thanks, Deb.
Thanks everyone for joining on a bit of a wet and woolly night, or has been through the day. But yeah, I guess timely that we're going to touch on just what's in the paddock, effective supplementation, but also what this rain is doing and implications, I guess, for feed quality, both in the paddock and in the silos. So I'm going to start with just the current season, what we're seeing at the moment, feed quality. Go through to animal requirements, issues you may need to watch out for over this summer with the rainfall and seasonal conditions, and also just effective supplementation. So looking at feed types on offer, and we'll also run through just a few feed tests I've seen so far this year and how the quality is looking. So, you know, picture in the mid-north yesterday, not what we want to see over harvest. So a pretty frustrating time, I understand, for everyone I'm sort of talking to. You know, I think south of me here in the mid-north, there are definitely parts that are hopefully benefiting from this rainfall. But definitely as we head further north, York's west coast, there's a lot of damage sort of happening. So I'll go through some of the implications for what that's meaning for you guys. So I guess here on the far right, we're seeing, you know, this disastrous looking sprouting of the grain on the heads. So what we've got going on there as far as quality, just the wet grain, the excessive moisture we're seeing around harvest, basically as the grain's ripening and it's getting wet, it's starting to sprout. So as far as feed quality, what we see there is the increase in an enzyme, which will start to convert the starch from that grain into sugars. So the first day, once it first starts to sprout, there's not a huge detrimental effect and reduction in energy of that grain. But as we get through to significant sprouts, and definitely 3 to 5 days sort of after sprouting, we start to see a deterioration of energy. So, you know, for you guys that are trying to deliver to silos, obviously falling numbers and quality implications. But from the feed and animal growth point of view, I'm looking at the deterioration, I guess, of energy available to an animal that we're going to see in a lot of the grain and downgraded to feed quality. So something we need to keep in mind with feedlot animals and feeding stock over summer on some of this grain, which we'll cover off as we go through. So the top left there, we've got hay paddocks. You know, a lot of hay luckily was undercover. There's still some in the paddock, which is going to have implications for quality and also mycotoxins. But we're also seeing this fast regrowth. And, you know, I was north today and saw, you know, up to a foot of regrowth in hay paddocks as you sort of headed north of Jamestown. So I think when we see this first early green shoots, you're looking at quite low dry matter, you know, under 10% dry matter often. Not a whole lot of feed value in it for the amount they need to harvest. But once we start to get some height in some of that green pick, it is going to have some grazing value for us over summer and even as it haze off. So, you know, if you don't need to spray that out, it potentially is going to give you some grazes. Looking at stubble quality in the bottom left there, anything that has been repped or dry stubble, hay stubbles that are being rained on, I just see a deterioration of the energy, protein and feed value in some of that dry feed. So, you know, every decent rain event will deteriorate quality by about 1 megajoule of energy. So we'll go through where some of that quality is sitting and where it might be sitting kind of as we go with the increasing rain we're sort of seeing over the last couple of weeks. So yeah, I guess in a standard season, I put up this sort of graph to understand kind of where the current feed situation is. So, you know, we're definitely getting down into this bottom right-hand side. So getting down low in digestibility. So when we assess the value of feed to an animal, we look at the digestibility percentage of the feed, and that's basically just the feed value and the percentage of the feed they're grazing that they can utilise. So when you look at your November-ish type period heading into December, we're starting summer at around 50 to 55% digestibility. So that means for every kilo of feed an animal grazes, they'll be utilising 550 grams, and 450 grams will be coming out in the manure. And when you look at digestibility, that's closely correlated to the energy, which we record in megajoules of energy per kilo dry matter. So as you can see there, we're getting down to sort of 6 megajoules of energy per kilo dry matter in a dry sort of grass and leaf. And then every rain on dry pasture or stubble, that's going to deteriorate further by, you know, approximately 1 megajoule of energy. So, you know, we could be in the situation that by January, we could be in that 4 to 5 megajoules rather than 5 to 6 that we would normally see, or even less. So when we look at what an animal needs for maintenance, it's all assessed in energy value. So by that deteriorating quality in energy, we're going to find animals aren't going to maintain condition as well as they normally did on a stubble that's had some significant rain events. So some of the other issues I'm looking at that we need to keep watch of with this sort of hot, humid, and then rain events we've been seeing. Top left-hand corner here, I've got a lupin stubble. And in the guy's hand there, we've got the stubble showing signs of the lupinosis fungus. So lupinosis is basically a disease in sheep which can cause quite a few deaths and also liver damage if it's consumed in smaller quantities. But basically it's present, as you can see on that stalk, by those black dots. That'll represent that there is fungus present, and you can also get it in lupin grain if it's been wet before it's been wrapped. So something to keep your eye out for in years like this where we have had humidity and then rain events. You have to be fairly careful with grazing any of these stubbles, because you will have a pretty strong likelihood of having some lupinosis present. So anyone that's seen lupinosis associated deaths are quite careful from there on your lupin stubbles. So the first thing is to monitor for those black dots, and also monitoring in your lupin seed that you don't have signs of the black fungus. The next, it's probably worth mentioning, after a rain event, it doesn't really go away. So it can stay present on that stubble in hay or in grain, you know, for a 12-month period. So it's something you kind of can't get rid of once you've got it on your stubble. So, you know, my idea with lupin stubbles is if you're worried about it or see evidence of lupinosis, it's probably not overly worth grazing. The bottom left there, we've got mouldy hay. So, you know, same situation we were faced with last year. We ended up with a lot of especially vetch hay that ended up black with these molds and mycotoxins. So some mycotoxins you can see, like the aflatoxin obvious mold, but there's also plenty of mycotoxins you can't see. So any hay that's got wet, humid, and baled, you know, not quite dry enough, you've got the potential for it to develop these mycotoxins. So you can get mycotoxin binders that you can feed that will help if you know you've got mycotoxins present in hay and silage. And there are companies that can do a quick test now just for the 3 major mycotoxins that affect ruminants. So it's something worth looking out for. I have seen it affect fertility, pregnancy, lamb growth rate. So I think it's something we underestimate in the ruminant space that it may have an effect.
Deb, just a quick question. What sort of companies do those sort of testing? Where would you send those samples?
Yeah, so it used to be a lot of testing overseas available for mycotoxins, and the problem was that it was sort of a 3 to 4 week turnaround time. So by the time you'd got the test back, you'd already put animals on paddocks or fed the hay. But Alltech, Lena at Roseworthy have just started doing like a rapid test. So within a couple of days, you can get a quick result of the 3 major mycotoxins present and whether they're high enough to have an effect on sheep and beef. So, you know, pigs and poultry are a lot more susceptible. Sheep and beef have a much higher tolerance, but my feeling is it's still worth checking.
And costs, do you know off the top of your head?
Roughly 60 to, I think, up to between $60 and $100. I can't remember exactly. I think it's around that $80 to $90 mark, but not excessive if you think you've got an issue that's going to cause potential production loss in your animals.
Fantastic.
And in saying that, in a humid, wet summers in the past, we have assessed even stubbles and stubble leaf and trash sort of piles that have had mycotoxin levels high enough to affect sheep production in certain areas in the mid-north and Yorke Peninsula. So it is sort of worth keeping an eye on when we do get these continuous rains and humidity, and you know, you start to see molds on stubbles or leaf or in sort of trash piles in paddocks even.
Yeah, thank you.
So the other thing I'll just touch on is summer crops. So yeah, the one on the right would be amazing to have. Probably not quite what we're going to grow in the next few months, but I know there has been people that have planted summer crops just due to the forecast wet spring and wet summer. So on the left, we've got your forage rape, just one of the brassica families, which can be an option over summer, depending on the rainfall we get going forward. But and then on the right, we've got your sorghums, or some of the sorghums are now crossed back with Sudan. So the issue with some of these summer crops we need to watch, obviously really good feed value if you can get something established. With your brassicas, if it does dry out, you can get sort of a build-up of nitrates in the soil, which with another following summer rain event. You can get nitrate sort of built up in the leaf. So also introducing to some of these brassicas, you need to be a bit careful just because they are quite rich, high in nitrate type feed. So there definitely has been cases of nitrate poisonings over summer in the brassicas. So just something to make sure you have your stock full when you're introducing them properly, but also you're just monitoring it after those dry spells, that you're not getting sort of toxicity from those plants. The other one with the sorghum, so the pure sorghums do have a high chance of prussic acid poisoning, which is another toxicity that you may see symptoms of in lambs and things that you've put on these feeds. So sulfur-based licks can help break down the prussic acid, but there are times where you'll just start to get high levels in the leaf, and again it's after a dry spell or when the plant's stressed. So if you haven't tried these feeds before, it's worth investigating how to introduce and issues to watch and symptoms before you suddenly put a heap of expensive lambs out on these summer feeds. So yeah, just a few things to keep in mind, I guess, over the current season. So the next thing I'm just going to touch on is your animal requirements over summer, because we'll start to sort of talk about some feed options, what might be happening in the paddock. And I just want to remind you guys of what your requirements are over the year of your use. So I guess what I'm seeing now is, you know, any late lambers have potentially still got lambs at foot or might be weaning sort of in the next 2 to 4 weeks. So, you know, still lactating, but getting to the end of that before sort of recovering from the lactation period for their second joining. And then other earlier lambers, you know, have been running dry ewes or just getting to that point of needing nutrition pre-joining, or the rams have gone in. So, you know, we are at the left-hand side of this table where basically we're only looking at that 10 megajoules per day of requirement for a 60 kilo ewe. So I guess, when we look at the pasture curve and the general summer period, which we don't have a lot of feed, most people will try and match it up to where the requirements at a minimum, which is that sort of 10 megs a day. So we'll just talk about what they kind of can get out of the dry pastures and stubbles, and you'll see how that kind of matches up. But yeah, anyone that's lambing at a different time or in a different phase, we do have that huge rise coming ahead into sort of autumn or spring, depending on your lambing. And we've got the twins there, the upper line, and singles at the bottom. Twins peaking at sort of 30 megajoules a day in lactation. So if you have lambed a bit later, you potentially could be back where you've still got quite a elevated requirement. So, I guess following a normal system, I'll talk about mostly dry use or early joined use. So the other thing I see a lot of is just growing out these young lambs. So, just weaned lambs, up to, I guess we're seeing anything up to 35 to 45 kilo lambs, depending on when they lambed. On the far right-hand side of this table, we've got, that requirement of just 5.7 to 6.8 megajoules of energy per head per day if they're grazing. And probably the key thing for your growing stock is also that protein requirement. So this is where I see, I guess, people often get let down on over summer with their growing stock, is they're just not supplying enough protein in the paddock. So yeah, if you just remember, you've got that sort of 10 megajoules a day and, 6 to sort of 7 for your growing weaners, more than that as they start to get heavier. So I guess what we're looking at from these dry feeds is just satisfying the energy requirement. So any mature animal we talk about, we look at energy just to maintain their cells, where when a growing animal's growing like a young lamb, we're actually trying to build extra cells. So that's when your protein requirement becomes crucial. So we'll talk about that as we go through talking about the dry feeds. But the next point I wanted to touch on is your dry summer feed, whether it's a pasture or stubble, is always deficient in salt and micro minerals also. So especially coming into joining, some of these micro minerals, your selenium, copper, cobalts, can have quite a positive benefit on egg production, sperm production, especially if you're deficient. So it's worth looking at whether you do have micro mineral sort of deficiency in your soils. The other crucial one I want to touch on over summer is calcium deficiency. So especially, myself that works mostly in cereal zones, we are seeing a lot of calcium deficiency come through pregnancy with ewes and also over lambing. And I think a lot of it starts with calcium deficiency over summer. So, I'm encouraging people to have calcium out anytime you're on a grain-based system. So that is even grain underneath a stubble or a grain feeder on a stubble or dry pasture. I'd encourage you to have calcium out. So, the option is just a lime salt lick as a minimum, or, there's a lot of good dry licks that have high calcium and reasonable salt levels in them to satisfy those requirements. So the other option we look at over summer, as I said, protein is often a deficiency over summer. So we've got this dry feed, often 4 to 6% protein, a little bit more if you've got some grain. But when you're looking at just dry leaf stalk on a stubble or dry pastures, you'll be getting a lot lower than that. And, a heavier lamb needing, probably 14% protein, a lighter lamb even higher again. Protein can be the limiting factor in a lot of summer grazing situations. So urea is one option to give you a small amount of protein. So what happens when animals are eating dry pastures or dry stubbles is they're consuming plenty of this fibrous feed. So I sort of like to think of as us trying to consume a heap of Wheat Bix or cardboard or something like that. But you actually need the microbes in the rumen to be fed to break down that really fibrous feed. So if you don't have enough protein feeding the rumen microbes, there's a limit to how much of that fibrous feed the animal can break down. So urea, especially on a ewe, on a stubble, can just give you that little bit of extra protein to keep those rumen bugs going. But I will touch on sort of growing lambs and better ways potentially to supplement them. But that's the things I like to think of as potential supplement options. So when we look at dry feed management, I guess I encourage you guys, there's a few key things, and the first one is just to measure. So measure quantity and quality of your dry feed. So rather than just, throwing them on a fresh stubble and thinking, oh, we normally put them out for 3 to 4 weeks, actually measure what's out there, measure the grain, and come up with a plan of how long it might hold your stock. So I'll talk a little bit about overgrazing too, and just where some ground cover targets might kind of be. And then once you've put them on these paddocks, it's just monitoring the paddocks and the stock, and making sure you move them prior to weight loss. So I guess I see a lot of animals being put on a stubble and, you're flat out with harvest or you've headed away for a few weeks holiday. And, they will drop weight quite quickly once the quality's gone out of it. And same with dry pastures. So when we look at stubble management, there's a few ways to assess how the value in a stubble. So the first thing I look at is the grain amount. So hopefully most of you have seen a standard quadrant, but a standard quadrant's just 0.1 of a metre square, and it's what we use to do sort of a pasture assessment of what's available in feed on offer. But what we basically do is just count the grains within this standard quadrant size. So with your cereal grains, 25 grains of wheat will give you 100 kilos per hectare of grain across that paddock, 28 grains of barley, 5 peas and 2 beans. So what I'd encourage you to do is basically take out a quadrant or measure out a quadrant area. And, I'd normally do 10 to 15 counts at least across a paddock, depending on the size of the paddock. You'll end up with an average number of either the cereal grains or legume grains within the quadrant. And that'll give you roughly the quantity of grain available in that stubble. So, looking at, I guess, last year with some of the wind damage we had up north, we had huge quantities of grain under a stubble. In a year where you've harvested and got most of it in the silo where you want it to be, you might only have, 40 or 30 kilos per hectare of grain available. So, that stubble is going to hold substantially less stock than what it would in a wind or hail damage year. So I guess this year we have again, unfortunately, seen some wind damage, some hail damage, and I've seen a few paddocks that are really getting right up there in grain quantity. There's probably 2 things to look at. So one is it'll hold stock for a long period of time. But the other thing you need to look at is whether you're going to have an acidosis risk of having huge quantities of available grain in a paddock. So once you get to huge amounts of, say, wheat, and the animal can sort of consume a kilo straight up quite easily, you're going to have to be pretty careful about introducing them to that stubble. So I guess when I look at a stubble feed quality, I look at first the grain. So any grain that's been left behind by the header, knocked down by wind damage, or any spilt piles of grain. The next thing we look at for quality is any green weeds that are reasonable grazing quality, or this year we're seeing a lot of sort of shot grain on the ground. So as I said, when that's first shot, it's probably not huge feed value because it is that high moisture, and they have to harvest so much of it to get enough to get the energy out of it. But once it starts to mature to a reasonable height, you will start to get, the dry matter percent will go up, it'll harden up a bit, and you'll get reasonable quality out of that. The next part is just the flag leaf and header trash. So in a standard year, when I've feed tested just the flag leaf, you'll get that 6 to 7, sometimes even megajoules of energy per kilo of dry matter. compared to your standing stubble straw that's left will only be around 3 megajoules per kilo dry matter. But as I said at the start, the problem with any stubbles that have from paddocks already repped or even the standing straw, the rain events we're having are leaching some of the quality out of it. So, you know, I'd be looking with your flag leaf, you could even end up down in that 4 to 5 megajoules and even 1 to 2 for your standing straw. So I think we're going to see a deterioration in quality once you're only left with the flag leaf and standing straw in your stubble paddocks. So I guess what I'm encouraging you guys to do is assess the feed quality and availability. So do those stubble counts and you get your head around pretty quickly if you look out in a paddock how much might be there and how long it might handle your stock. You know, for any growing stock or animals with a reasonable energy requirement, if you're not seeing much grain on the ground, you know, not a whole lot of regrowth, it's often time to move the animals on. The other thing is to condition score or weigh your stock, so you can sort of pick that point or determine that you have sort of gone too far and they've started to deteriorate, especially, you know, pre-feedlot weight if you're trying to grow out some weather lambs. You know, I really don't like seeing them lose 3 to 4 kilos live weight on a stubble and then you spend couple of weeks in the feedlot trying to put the same weight back on. So it's important to assess your feed quality to work out when they're going to start losing weight. The other thing is your weeds and toxins. So I guess that's a problem with this rain also, is just some of those weeds we're seeing. So, you know, there are potato weed and things that are going to cause issues. You know, the sheep will always chase that green pick. And there are plenty of weeds around that'll give you sort of long-term liver damage if they eat too much of it. So important just to walk your paddocks, check if there's any weeds, and then, you know, assess for mycotoxins if you are starting to really get some molds and issues in your stubbles, that it's not going to cause an effect, especially over joining. So with your dry pastures, so obviously there's some areas that have benefited from the rain. So, you know, north I was today, we've ended up with some pretty lush looking bindi paddocks, and some of your native pastures are really going to benefit from what we've seen. But in general, in more arable country where you've sown dry pastures, you're going to have that leaching effect of feed that's already dried out or been spray topped. And then the reasonably large rain events we've had on it leaching out some of the energy and protein. So the first thing is to just assess feed on offer. So with feed on offer, we're basically just using a quadrant again, just doing a cut and just weighing up within a quadrant how many grams of feed we've got within that 0.1 square meter quadrant, timesing that by 100, and that's giving us the kilograms of green matter per hectare. And then, you know, with a standard dry pasture, they're probably similar dry matter percentage to what we see hay. So you're sitting at around that 90% dry matter. So we're just then timesing that green matter per hectare quantity by 0.9, and that'll give us kilos dry matter per hectare. So I think if you know what feed on offer you've got available in a dry pasture paddock, you know, without green shoots coming underneath, you're generally not generating more feed over summer. So you can then work out numbers of days to graze it to your bottom point of where you want to graze the paddock down to. So when we look at feed quality, you know, some of your dried medics and legumes can have quite reasonable feed quality still dry. But, you know, a lot of sort of paddocks that have been left out, hills paddocks, we do often end up with this predominant sort of barley grass, wild oat type proportion, which your digestibility is starting to get quite low. So, you know, generally we start around that 55% at the start of summer, which was giving you that 7 megajoules per kilo dry matter, and then it deteriorates as you go on. So there's generally not a whole heap of feed quality in those native type grasses, but if it's improved pasture, you could still have reasonable quality dry. The other thing with your dry pastures and your stubbles is just your NDF, which is your neutral detergent fibre content. So basically, as a pasture or stubble matures, your fiber content will get higher. So it's actually the fiber content that controls the intake and the ability of that animal to consume that feed. So as it gets drier, more fibrous, you'll find an animal can't really fit in enough of that feed, which is why once you get your stubbles down to just stalk, you know, or you're trying to maintain stock on a bale of straw or a really average sort of dry pasture paddock, they just won't ever be able to consume enough of that dry feed to maintain their condition. So that's where we need to look at supplementation. So I guess, again, I want you guys on your dry pasture paddocks, hills paddocks, assess feed quality and availability. Condition scoring or weighing stock's the best way to see how they're responding to that paddock. And also monitoring weeds when we've had rains like we have is a crucial one. So I touched on urea. So I guess just one of the common questions I get is, you know, what licks should we use over summer? What's going to help the ewes do okay on a paddock like the one you see there on your left? So, you know, I guess my key message tonight is when you're looking at a stubble to assess, you know, where your ewes are at, what their requirement is, but also what's in the paddock. So if you've got a reasonable amount of grain and they're able to consume grain with the leaf and the stalk, you know, they're getting a reasonable nutritional balance. A small amount of urea, or there are slow release protein products now that are available in some of the licks or blocks that will deliver protein out to the rumen over sort of a 12-hour period rather than just the quick hit of protein you get with urea in a lick. But they will help them break down a bit more of the fibrous feed. But, you know, I look at there is a point where it's better value to use a feed supplement. So either a full feed pellet, you know, a protein source like lupins, beans or peas can often just top up protein energy that might be missing from a depleted stubble, or even a good stubble with growing lambs. Urea doesn't always give you everything you need for an animal that's got a higher requirement for energy and protein. So the lambs you see on the right, you know, kicking around 170 bucks a head or whatever now. So, you know, if you're going to background them on a stubble and put them in a feedlot, I tend to look at supplementing with a grain or full feed supplement rather than just a urea based lick. So I guess it's looking at requirement and what you're trying to achieve, or whether you're just trying to do a quick top up for a dry ewe. So I guess some key points when we look at grazing. So, you know, on the left, we've got just a typical cropping scenario, you know, a fairly grazed down paddock. You've got your cereal sown in the rows. So, you know, straight away we can deteriorate pretty well to 50% ground cover because the area between the rows is bare and we've got a bit of cover in the rows. So, you know, my general key is to try and keep that 70% ground cover plus over summer. So I guess in plenty of areas, we've seen this really, you know, we've seen plenty of dry years in a row. And we've seen that we've got down in ground cover and the pasture recovery, you know, especially on hills and pasture paddocks has just been really slow. So, you know, I like to use that 70% ground cover as a bit of a target. You know, when you're looking at dry pastures, it's brilliant if you can carry that sort of 1.5 tonne, 1,500 kilos of dry matter per hectare of pasture on offer. Plenty of people probably get down to 800 to 1,000, especially last year with the late break. But I think you need to have a target in mind that you don't want to graze below to maintain your dry cover and pasture into the following year. And it really does help those pasture paddocks recover after a rain. And, you know, just a bit of a prompt, as Jody said, I do a lot on containment, but, you know, containment or a sacrifice paddock can be a really good option if the season doesn't work with us and we do get another late break. It can basically just give you an option to not keep smashing out stubbles or dry paddocks, but getting the animals off if we need to. So I'm just going to go through some of the feed types, and I've got a few sort of early hay results just to run through. So I guess last year what we saw with the hay was a lot of paddocks were cut a bit late. As hay gets sort of cut later, stalkier, digestibility and energy start to deteriorate, and fibre level goes up quite high. So as I said before with your dry pastures, it's that neutral detergent fibre, or NDF, that controls the ability of the animal to intake feed. So a lot of the hay we saw last year was getting really high in NDF, and it did limit intake from an animal. So some of the hays I've just had analysed recently. So the first one was an exceptional quality hay. It was cut quite early. You know, moisture probably a little bit higher than normal at that 13.4%. So 86.6% of it was dry matter. Crude protein. So this was had a legume. It was vetch oat and also had a fair bit of ryegrass in it. Hay, cut at the point of flowering. So yeah, cut at really the perfect time to not get too fibrous and deteriorate in digestibility. So you can see there, third row down, we've got crude protein up at 12%, which is pretty good for a cereal mix hay. So last year, I guess we're seeing NDFs around that 60%. This is probably the lowest one I've seen this year, you know, at 38.7%. So that's a really high quality hay. There's going to be absolutely no limit to what an animal can intake, except for just their standard body weight, restricting them to about 3.5% of their body weight, where, you know, a lot of the hays we saw last year, an animal wasn't able to eat any more than sort of 2% of their body weight. So they were pulling it up at just over a kilo of sort of hay and just not getting the energy they needed because of the fibre levels. So when you look at this hay, if we look at digestibility about halfway down, so that's sitting at 77.4%, which is very high. And this is giving us an energy of 11.7 megajoules per kilo. So if you imagine a 60 kilo ewe only needing 10 megajoules, you know, they're only going to need 900 grams of that hay a day to maintain, which is, yeah, a hell of a lot less than what they needed last year of the lower energy, lower digestibility hay we saw being cut. So just to remind you, I guess when the hay is cut, when you look at this chart of what happens over the season, when we look at hay, you know, when it's at that early flowering, mid-flowering, you know, during September, October, there's that point your digestibility is still quite high. So sorry, that should be 80 on the left-hand axis at the top. So, you know, you're sitting between that 70 to 80%. Legumes will always be at the top of that chart at the same stage, where your grasses and things will always be at the bottom. So that's where, you know, a clover hay, a vetch in your hay will always help that digestibility stay a bit higher. So, you know, it is, if we can cut it sort of before it flowers or gets into late flowering and dry, you'll be always sitting around that 10 to 12 megajoules, where the issue last year when we got a bit wet and couldn't cut it on time, or any hay that's been left standing now, is that it's deteriorating quality before we've been able to get it into the shed. And as the quality goes down there with your digestibility and energy, your NDF or your fibre goes up. So that then limits how much an animal can process in the rumen and consume in a day. So the next Oaten hay, a northern Oaten hay, I only got back today. So this one, you know, probably about the quality I'm seeing of most Oaten hays this year. So, you know, protein probably a little bit lower on this hay at around 8%. So obviously for a growing animal, they would need a top up of protein if this was all they were getting. But you see there your NDF at around 52.7. So there'll be a slight limiting of intake due to NDF, but not as bad as sort of the hays we saw last year that was sitting more around that 60 to 65% NDF. So, you know, still quite a reasonable quality hay. And the energy there at just under 10 megajoules per kilo dry matter, and digestibility still up near at 67%. So that's quite a reasonable quality hay still. So I'll just look at the NDF. So with that one, we'll get 2.3% of body weight, which we just use a simple NDF equation of 120 divided by the NDF will give us the percent body weight the animal can consume. So a ewe will easily be able to consume 1.4 kilos a day of this hay, a 60 kilo ewe. So we'll easily be getting that 14 megajoules per kilo dry matter. So, you know, if that was ad lib in a paddock, that would easily support a dry ewe through to sort of early pregnancy with no problems. So I guess when we're looking at effective supplementation, so there's a New South Wales drought calculator, which you can actually compare units of energy and units of protein and choose the best value, whether you're chasing energy or protein. But I guess I've put some common averages, which, you know, will change a little bit this year, but I guess so far I'm seeing in some regions barley protein is a bit higher than this, so we're probably getting back to that sort of 13 to 15% protein. It'll be interesting to see what happens with some of the grain after the rain. Energy, you know, last year we're easily getting that 12 to 13 megajoules per kilo dry matter, but as I said, some of your barley that's going to be downgraded, you could find that your energy drops considerably. So that does make a major difference to how much you need to feed a ewe. You know, lupin. So as I said, often with your stubbles and dry pastures, it's actually the protein that's the limiting factor. So you're then going to be better off with lupins, peas, beans, maybe, rather than a cereal grain, but it depends what else they're consuming. So, you know, your lupins are normally that 32% protein. Peas and beans will be more that 20 to 22%. So I pretty much just compare the price per tonne of lupins for the 32% protein compared to peas and beans at 20 to 22% protein and work out what's the best value protein to feed your sheep. And obviously, if they're growing, that's what we're going to be chasing, where if they're maintaining, we're going to be chasing probably more energy. So, you know, oats are generally a little bit lower in energy per kilo of dry matter, and your protein will drop off. And your trit and wheat often a little bit higher on energy, but as the starch content goes up on some of those trit and wheat grains, you do need to be a bit more careful at feeding it to stock and introducing it. So I guess when we're looking at the different types of grain, it's just working out what you're chasing, whether it is energy or protein, what's the best value, and we can sort of do a feed budget then to work out how much they should be eating once we've worked out the shortfall in the dry pasture or the stubble. So I'll go through a few examples with you guys. What I haven't put in also is full feed pellets. So full feed pellets this year, the prices I've sort of sought out have probably not been too bad when we look at the forecast on barley grain. So, you know, it's worth shopping around. Sometimes full feed pellets, especially when you're feedlotting small numbers of animals, can be a really viable option. So you'll end up with your formulated energy, protein at the right level, and good ones will contain a full mineral mix that will help balance out those calcium issues we're seeing. And it should have microminerals, vitamins, everything you need in there for an animal to grow or to maintain a ewe. So it's worth doing the comparison on cost on everything available in the market, I guess, just not just what's on your farm. So I guess looking at some standard scenarios, so I've got ewes pre-joining on fresh barley stubbles. So, you know, we're looking at this 60 kilo ewe around that 10 megajoules per head per day is their standard requirement, just a little bit under. So when we look at grazing a stubble, if there's plenty of grain available, so, you know, 1 to 200 kilos per hectare, a ewe will often consume around that 700 grams per DSE. So, you know, there's plenty of DSE charts available, but a 60 kilo ewe is that 1.2 DSE. So, I'd calculate out that they're eating 0.84 kilos per head per day as fed. So when we look at as fed of grain, that's the physical grain they're consuming. Most barley grain is 90% dry matter. So I've basically just times that by 0.9 to work out they're eating 0.76 kilos per head per day dry matter. So, then looking at the energy content of the grain available, 12.8 megajoules of energy per kilo dry matter was what that barley tested out at, or was average for that year. So what we find is that animal's easily able to consume the 0.76 kilos times the energy value. So they're easily getting their 9.73 megajoules of energy per day. But I guess the point I see then those ewes losing weight is once the grain's all been depleted and they're just back to eating flag leaf and stalk. So, if they've joined, they're in good condition, they can sit on that for a little while, but there'll be a point when they'll start to lose weight further again on that. So it's just worth saying that you've got enough barley. Once you walk out into the stubble and you can't really find any barley grains, it's definitely time to move those ewes on, especially if they're going into early pregnancy. So the other example is just, so as I said, your growing lambs is a bit of a different situation. So we've got these 40 kilo lambs on a dry pasture paddock. So we're actually really pushing these heavier lambs for growth. So looking at a standard sort of merino weaner chart that we're trying to grow the animal substantially, we'll be looking at 13 megajoules per head per day of energy, plus they'll often need a protein top up as well. So as I said, your protein's just a little bit low on a lot of these pastures. So your standard dry pasture, so this is your dry pasture paddock, not your stubble. At the start of summer, we'll only be looking at around 6 megajoules of energy per kilo dry matter. It's only 50% digestibility, so they're only utilising half of it. The NDF starting to get high, so it's at 55%, and we've got 2 tonne of dry matter on offer. So we've got a reasonable stand of dry pasture left. So based on the dry feeds, as I said, it is the fibre level that's going to pull the animals up. So based on that 55% fibre level, that lamb is only going to be able to eat a kilo of that feed a day. So that means they're only going to get 6 megajoules per day out of that dry pasture paddock. So you can see how quickly a lamb would go backwards if they're on a depleted stubble with no grain or a dry pasture paddock. So they've actually got a 7 megajoule per day deficiency in energy, which straight away means they'll lose weight and condition score. So looking at topping up a supplement, so when they're consuming a lot of dry feed in a pasture or a stubble, you do need to supplement with an energy dense feed because they don't have enough gut space after consuming all of the fibre to fit in more fibre. So an effective supplement in this case would be barley, still testing at that roughly 12.8 megajoules of energy per kilo. So yeah, we're looking at basically providing 550 grams a day of barley dry matter times the energy is going to give us that 7.04 megajoules of energy per day. So basically we're giving 600 grams a day of barley as fed. Will give you a bit under that 550 grams and will give you the energy they need. So I guess we're just working out a basic budget there of what's missing on a dry pasture paddock and what that animal might need to grow. And then it's worth also checking your protein level. So as I said, if protein's deficient, depending on the feed test of that barley, you may have to put that 15 to 20% lupins in the feeder too to keep them moving ahead. So yeah, I guess it's just identifying those points where you are losing weight and you need to look at an effective supplementation program for either ewes or lambs. So yeah, hopefully that's given you a few ideas of what might be missing, what we could be looking at, I guess, over the following summer and what we need to watch. So I guess the first thing is for you guys is just to determine what quality of feed is available in the paddock or that you've stored in your silos. So, if your grain does get down to F3, F4 that you're left to feed in a feedlot, understanding your energy is likely to be less per kilo dry matter, and that's definitely going to affect your growth rate. Or you're going to need to feed more to maintain a ewe. And the same as what we discussed in the paddock. So your stubbles are likely to be less quality, the same as your dry pastures with the rain we've had. So the other thing I want you to watch for is these mycotoxins, the lupinosis, or any toxic weeds that may have grown that you haven't noticed. So I guess it's worth going for a drive or a walk around your paddock before you start seeing sort of ewes or lambs fall over summer. Assessing the feed quality. So, with your dry pastures, what the percentage of, medic or legume percent might be that's still providing reasonable quality, or is it these native grasses and things that have really deteriorated? Is there grain, is there flag leaf left, or have you just put them on a standing sort of straw with what's left of a stubble? And then I want you to think about what is the right supplement. So what's the most economical way for you guys to provide energy protein in the paddock? How much do I need and how long for? So there are some feed budget webinars that we did late last year that if you're not sure how to calculate how much they need, how long, there's some of those you'll be able to watch back through Sheep Connect. So yeah, thank you for your time. And yeah, I'm hoping for all of your sake the rain clears up and we can get a decent harvest in and, we retain some quality in the paddock and in the grain, really. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Deb. We've got a few questions, but I encourage people, if they've got some others, to pop them in the Q&A box or even in the chat. And if you've got my mobile number close and handy, you can always flick me a text. Deb, there was just someone wanted just to recap on this. You talked earlier about soil micro minerals and testing. What ones would they be testing for and when? Was the question?
Yep. So I guess we're just looking at deficiencies in general. So when I talk about micro minerals, it'll be your copper, cobalt, selenium, I guess more common in coastal situations. So we probably don't see a whole heap of deficiencies through the middle here, but you can just do a standard soil test just to get a bit of an idea of where your paddocks are sitting for your cropping or arable pasture country anyway, and then just see if there's any levels that are sort of high or low in any of those micro minerals. And I guess it gives you a little bit of an idea of whether you're going to have any serious deficiencies passing into growing feed and then into the animals.
Great, thank you. A question come in about you talked about urea. How do you feed it? How's best to feed it?
Yeah. So I guess, there are people that will do their own sort of home mixes with urea, but I probably prefer something that's relatively formulated. And, I guess I find it can just be an effective way to supplement if it's got your calcium, your protein level right, your salt at the right levels that they're consuming the right amount. There are people in saltier areas that'll mix urea sort of through molasses and things to get it to be uptaken that way. You do need to be a little bit careful with urea toxicity too. So you definitely don't want them to go from nothing to large amounts of urea, which is why I guess I find those pre-formulated licks often have salt at the correct level, that they don't really just get a sudden hit of urea. And, I guess the other point is some of them are waterproof. So, in summers like this where we are getting the rain, you don't end up with a wet urea lick, a water pool in the top of a block that's urea. You end up with dissolved urea toxicity straight away for any animal that goes over to it. So it is something you need to watch in the rain.
Someone's after some good resources to set up containment pens. Where would you direct them?
So there's a good landscapes board document, which I'm currently reviewing at the moment, which has just some standard sizings and, things you need to think about, I guess, with water, trough spacing and things. So that's a good document, which, yeah, I think if you search Landscapes Board, you should be able to find that on their website. Or if you flick me an email, I'm happy to send it through to you. There's also been quite a lot of webinars. So I know Hamish Dixon did one for Barossa Grazing Group 2 or 3 years ago. I did one for Arid Lands last year on just setup. So if you literally Google containment feeding webinar setup South Australia or Arid Lands, I think you'll find some of those quite easily. But yeah, whoever it is, if you want to flick me an email, I'm happy to just email you some of those resources so you don't have to spend ages searching for them.
Yep. And if you check out this month's e-news from Sheep Connect, I've actually written a bit of an article about a few of those resources. So there's some great ones out there from, as Deb mentioned, the natural resources. Also reviewed a couple of other ones, and you'll see those in the e-news. So,
cool. But yeah, probably worth pointing out, it's good to consider feeding options and how you're going to feed using containment before you start building fences, because I probably see a lot of things that should have been done different ways, and then it becomes pretty tricky to turn it back around the way you want, or feeding troughs from self-feeders. So it's good to have a really good think, ask people, talk to some professionals and work out what you're chasing before you start fencing just a pen.
Yeah, great advice there, Deb. Thank you to everyone who joined us for today's webinar. Deb, thank you for sharing your insight and expertise. I'd like to acknowledge our funders of tonight's webinar, Australian Wool Innovation, SA Sheep Industry Fund, the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program and the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund, and the Landscape Levies. If anyone has any additional questions, you can contact us directly using the contact information on your webinar registration. Thank you for your time and have a lovely evening.